Good afternoon and welcome everyone. And thank you so much for your patience with our technical difficulties this afternoon. My name is Maureen Conway. I'm a Vice President at the Aspen Institute and Executive Director of the Economic Opportunities Program. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation, The Workers Behind Our Groceries, a book talk with Benjamin Lorr. This conversation is a collaboration between the Food and Society Program and the Economic Opportunities Program here at the Aspen Institute, and is the third and final event in our three-part series, The Hands That Feed Us, Job Quality Challenges in the Food Supply Chain. Before we start, I want to just do a quick review of our technology. All attendees are muted. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit and upvote questions. Please do share your perspective, ideas, and experiences related to today's topic in the chat. Also, do please take a moment to respond to our quick feedback survey, which should pop up on your screen when you leave today's session. We encourage you to post about this conversation on the social media platform of your choice. Our hashtag is Talk Opportunity. If you have any technical issues during this webinar, you can please send us a message in the chat or send us a note at eop.program@aspeninstitute.org. This event is being recorded and will be shared via email and posted on our website following the close of the session. Closed captions are available. Please use the CC button at the bottom of your screen to activate them. I just want to say a quick note of thanks to my colleague Corby Kummer and his team at the Food and Society Program for our collaboration on this series. It has been really terrific working with them on our central passions around good food and good work and how they should intersect more. This series has helped us really explore ways in which our food systems fall short and, to put it mildly, in providing good food and good work. I'm also thrilled we're closing this series with the discussion of Benjamin Lorr's excellent book, The Secret Life of Groceries. He really goes through workers all across the food chain, and it's just an excellent set of issues to use in our closing session. So with that, let me hand the mic over to you, Corby, to take away today's discussion. Thank you both so much.
Maureen, and really the thanks are all to Maureen, Matt Helmer, and the Economic Opportunities Program, which is an inspiration to all of us who work at the Aspen Institute. I invite everybody to look on Economic Opportunities Program site and our Food and Society site, where we have Food Leaders Fellows. We're about to announce our third cohort who work on the food system and job quality, but no one is better informed on this than Benjamin Lorr. His Secret Life of Groceries is a landmark book about the food system, about the people who work in it, and it really opens your eyes to your so-called enlightened choices when you go to the supermarket. And also, I have to say, I for decades have been a food writer, and I was working with my agent on a book about grocery stores, a backstage look. I didn't tell Ben this. And I thought, nobody's done this. I'm going to go underground and work in a grocery store. I would have done so much worse a job than Benjamin Lorr. He did a beautiful job, and he did such great reporting and great writing. And because we're starting late, I'm starting with him right away. And I'm going to read you something you said in a Q&A about labor and about going underground or just working in a food store. It happened to be a Whole Foods in Bowery in New York, which Bowery, whatever its associations, it's now a very upscale Manhattan neighborhood. This is an upscale market, probably with entitled. There's a great quote about what people think their food choices say about them, but I'm going to start about labor. I was really surprised, Ben Lorr writes in The Secret, has written about in The Secret Life of Groceries, the ways these minimum jobs minimum wage jobs have changed. I've worked a lot of minimum wage jobs over the years. I worked them 20 years ago in high school, right after college. I had a memory of them almost tinged by nostalgia. But just like everywhere else in the chain, labor in retail has become more quote unquote efficient. Industry-wide practices like variable scheduling, on-call scheduling, just-in-time scheduling, where employees don't have a fixed schedule, rather one that varies week to week by up to 40%, or only receive their schedule a few days in advance, have devastating effects. You can't get a second job. There's no schedule to schedule around. Can't arrange childcare. Your take-home pay swings wildly, and the changes in hours worked. That's a brilliant observation. Could you also paint a picture for us? What was it like to work in supermarkets? And also, you did other kinds of food labor. And welcome, Ben
Yeah.
Lorr.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. First, and apologies for robbing the world of your undercover grocery expose. I think we're all at a loss for that. So yeah, I mean, it's great to just be here and start off with this. When I started off this book, I did not really think I was writing a book about labor, but it really rapidly transformed into one just by talking about what the pressing issues in the food system, that define groceries, that define the factors that get food to shelf. It all boiled back to labor. It all boiled back to all these hidden actors. So your question on like what it was like to work in a retail food store, I had the most dilettantish experience doing this because I was working while writing, with a significant other source of income. So I don't want to make too much of it as a way of understanding. I will say I ended up working in two different chains, one of which isn't even featured in the book. It was just kind of like background for me to like make sure that what I was saying about the Whole Foods I was working at was not some type of crazy atypical experience. Um, Overall, there was a lot of pleasurable aspects of the retail grocery experience. At this point, the retail grocer, and I was behind the counter. I was not at checkout, which is a mind drubbing part of the store. I think maybe a different place, but you're there as customer service. You're there to provide a smile for people. I was front facing, and so I think the experience that I had was very different from somebody who works behind the scenes, who works at a dark store, who works in a warehouse, who works even below carving the fresh fruit, carving mold spots off for the prepackaged fresh. Um, my experience was one that was probably not so different from the retail experience of 20 years ago. The scheduling piece that you pointed out was a market change in terms of not knowing when you were going to work, not knowing the duration of your shift, walking into it, or at least being prepared from prior experience that you might just be told to go home because the day was slow, and thus not being able to rely on any of you're just not having any fixed sense of an income. So in that way, it was a mixture of truly, and I think Whole Foods really selects, and I go out of my way to say this, they really select for kind of outgoing, extroverted employees who genuinely like social interaction. That part of the job, as much as we might want to think that's like an oppressive structure for, that's us, I think, projecting onto the people we see in the food system all of the things that are going on behind the scenes that we might understand in the back of our minds are going on. We think that this retail interaction is something troubling, but I think it's a drop in the bucket.
Two questions. Did your colleagues have a choice as to whether they got a front-facing job or not? And did you hear a lot of complaints backstage about where they were positioned in the store? Were you plucked out because you clearly had an education and you would match much more the kind of customers there? Did you volunteer for it? In other words, how much autonomy did you have, and how did you feel that compared to the autonomy of your colleagues? Then I'll ask another question.
Yeah. I think there were a number of frustrations. I mean, any retail job, low paying job, when you get to questions of choice around autonomy, you get to the question of like, well, how much choice do you have when you're in a system where you have to work and jobs are scarce? So there's always this thin threat of being a team player at a place like Whole Foods, where there is a vocal culture that encourages you to speak up and advocate for yourself. And there is a silent threat that if you're not a team player, you might be asked to play for a different team at a different store because you're not a fit for the culture. So there is this like dual mindset that I don't want to pay short shrift to because uh, I heard a lot of people talk about that. There was a lot of frustration with the pace of advancement in Whole Foods. I think there was not a lot of frustration, however, in where people were placed in the stores. I think people were happy to be where they were, and there was an ability to transfer after you were working there 6 months from place to place. And there was enough turnover at the store that if you made it through those 6 months, you could probably find there would be an opening in the store, and you were credibly received in your department, you'd be able to move right along.
And can you tell us, first of all, did it change your personal behavior toward other workers, or were you always unfailingly gracious as a customer, so you needed no change at all? And then tell us about other jobs you worked while researching the book.
Oh gosh. I mean, I think the one thing it probably changed is, I mean, when you're on the other side of these retail interactions, you realize just how over the top effusive many people are in their thanks of you. So I would have these moments where people would make extended lascivious eye contact with me as a clerk, and I'm handing them their like packaged fish. And it just, they'd be like these, you've seen the Saturday Night Live sketch where they're saying bye bye, bye bye. It was like kind of the exact opposite, where they're like trying to take this small intimate moment and like extend it into like this meaningful interaction where they're thanking you so much for your service. So if anything, I became more self-conscious that I played into that dynamic my whole life and have been going through retail interactions like with ridiculous sopping over the top praise to someone who does not care about it at all because
Did
they're
this
more
have
concerned
anything to do
with the
with the
other things.
timing of COVID and the heroicizing of so-called essential workers, which I fear vanished after COVID?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. This was all pre-COVID. All the research of the book had concluded by fall of 2019. So my experience was different, but I think you make a great point that when you were a retail worker, especially during this phase of COVID, you were deemed an essential worker. You were people are banging pots and pans as they stay at home and you're forced to go to work, and you get a hero's pay bonus for 2 weeks, maybe 2 months. And then you watch as there's a giant stock buyback at the end of the year because these grocery chains are literally making record profits. And your hero pay disappears. You go back to normal. I think it bred a lot of resentment.
To your knowledge, one of the questions that came in, because luckily many participants did send questions in beforehand. To your knowledge, did any of these COVID-19 bonuses have an effect on the wage structure? And do you suppose that the kind of disillusionment or kind of morning after effect you've just been describing has anything to do with the strengthening of union attempts among food service workers?
Oh, undoubtedly, undoubtedly. I think there was a real solidarity that developed during COVID. I think it translated into, it coincided with a high watermark in at least a local high watermark for union relationships, and it certainly was an additive factor there. I think that it was a period where if you we're talking to frontline grocery workers, it was an extremely stressful, same thing that was happening to teachers. These are frontline workers who are getting burnt out at never before seen levels. They were making they were making very little money, while white collar professionals were told that their patriotic duty was to stay home and limit care, and limit contact. So, they were very attuned to that hypocrisy.
How should we view, for a while, Amazon, after it bought Whole Foods, announced a whole redesign of its stores, which it hasn't abandoned, but it hasn't really gone forward with, in which only the front of the store with fresh produce and counters like the one where you were having people smile a little too long as you were serving them would remain. And all of this behind the scenes work of the non-front facing workers would be roboticized. How should we
Yeah.
view that? Is that a direct assault on jobs and wages? Or given the often kind of inhuman conditions of that work, is it a good thing? Where should we be thinking about that attempt?
I will say it's something I've thought a lot about. I thought a lot about it in the context of trucking, where the automation of trucking is coming. It's something that's beloved. It's going to be an earthquake for this, um, e- e- extremely important sector where huge, majority of states, it's the number one employer. I think after spending time with those jobs, it became impossible for me to defend business as usual and impossible for me to romanticize the idea of maintaining those jobs. At the other hand, I think it's a social question that, again, the grocery book was great at surfacing these things that can become microcosms of larger flags in how capitalism is structured right now, larger flags in how our trade relationships with other countries are, larger flags, but it doesn't provide answers. It's just the tip of the iceberg. And so um, I think the real danger for me is the jobs that aren't able to be automized, aren't able to be roboticized, which there are numbers of which, but that get then shuttered behind the scenes. So when you're a front-facing worker who's selected because you have a nice smile and a great interpersonal demeanor, your job is going to be okay. If you are then put behind the scenes in a dark store or in a roboticized Amazon store where you're essentially transformed into a human robot, your working conditions are going to deteriorate. The like remaining incentives to treat you like a human being just diminish a little bit more. And so I think that shift is something that COVID very much accelerated with, you have like 30-minute grocery delivery, all of that stuff really accelerated these trends. I think that's a very dangerous, bad, disturbing trend. We are not good as a society at labor enforcement locally. We're not good at it internationally. And so the more that we put people into vulnerable jobs behind the scenes in industries where there's a pattern of abuse, that's not great.
So would you become a supporter of the attempt to make more of those, give more of those jobs to robots if they're inhuman already?
Well, not with, well, right now we don't have a society that's structured for the rise of robots. We need to give people basic living, if that was coupled with some type of UBI, universal income, and again, these are things that are way out of my pay grade as a writer I mean, I have not written a book on UBI. I don't understand well enough all the ramifications, but I don't think without a strong social safety net, we can be like, aha, this job is so horrible. What we're going to do is roboticize it and you're going to be better off, because right now what you'll be just left without a job. And that's obviously a worse situation. In fact, that is the situation overseas where you have people who enter in true bonded labor, enslaved labor situations where they have no source of income. So they're so desperate to be active participants in their own lives and that they put themselves in extremely desperate situations to get a job. So yeah, great. Let's roboticize things, but let's build a real safety net for people that they can survive without those jobs. Until then, I think no. Even if it's a horrible job, it's probably better than nothing, which is again not the solution I'm advocating for either.
You mentioned trucking, and you just slipped in the fact because it's so familiar to you, and it was not to me, and maybe to many of our viewers, that it's the number one industry in many states. I found that staggering. I never think about it. You also quoted someone, either a person or an industry-wide saying that a lot of the jobs are sharecropping on wheels. Can you talk about what that statement means and what it was like for you to observe and embed with truckers?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was extremely eye-opening for me as well when I got into it. First, trucking, enormous, 10 billion tons of freight trucked around this country every day. That breaks down to about 350 pounds per man, woman, child per day. that's being shipped on your behalf. So there's just 350 pounds out there right now. That's your 350 pounds. It's like a staggering amount of our lives that are being moved around. It's a staggering amount of labor that goes into it. As you said, it's the number one profession in a majority of the states, or at least it was when I was writing this. And it's an exceedingly dangerous job. It's on the top 10 lists of most risky professions every year. And it's transformed. So as you were saying, yeah, the truckers will call it sharecropping on wheels. I certainly describe in the book a system that is very close to sharecropping or to a form of bonded labor. That's very different from our romantic perceptions of it. I grew up with this image of the 1970s, Smokey and the Bandit, outlaw trucker, CB radio, kind of an outlaw, but he was lovable. And, like that's the trucker I thought I was going to be covering in this book. And that is a very outdated model. There was an intense deregulation of the trucking industry spanning harder to Reagan. So it's not actually something we can just say like, oh, this was an evil Republican, Reagan conservative deregulation thing. This was trucking at prior, and it was tightly controlled by a few kind of cartel-like carriers. It was radically deregulated. And the trucker themselves, as part of that deregulation, became kind of a low-cost bidder. There was freight, the cost for shipping freight plummeted, which was great. It reduced prices, but it made the trucker themselves kind of a commodity in the fleets, in the carriers. This had a number of like ripple effects that I could get into. Probably the most, the one I spend the most time on in the book, and the one that I found the most threatening, and the one that really dovetails on this like sharecropping metaphor, was the way that trucking carriers use CDL licenses and career education and training programs, and then the promise of becoming an owner operator and lease programs to gain financial control over truckers. And so essentially they make outlandish promises as to the quality of a trucking job, recruit rapaciously from people who, a lot of veterans who are coming back, minimum wage retail workers. There's stories of them recruiting right out of homeless shelters. But they make these huge promises. You go, you sign on, you accumulate a heavy amount of debt as part of your education program to get into that. They then work you at training rates, because trucking, like any job, and especially because it's so dangerous, it's not an unskilled job. It may be blue collar, but it's absolutely not unskilled. And so you're not equipped to just drive a big rig when you walk in off the floors of a Walmart that you had been working at and thought you're going to walk into this 6-figure job. You need to train, and those training rates are extremely low. They're extremely profitable for the trucking company, and they wield the debt that you have to prevent you from being a free actor in the market and going from carrier to carrier. So you're beholden to a single carrier, and it just sets up lots of abusive structures that keep people held at one place, and then because you're contractually obligated to that one place, when they decide that you're no longer profitable for them, whether that's because your training rates are up, whether that's because you complain a little too much, they quote unquote starve you out, which is like reduce your miles, and you get flushed from the system. The trucking industry that I followed had turnover from 96 to 112%, which is again a mind-boggling turnover. Turnover at a top law firm, which was like deemed a crisis for the profession, is at about 17%. Turnover at Starbucks is like 60% or so. So just to put that in perspective, we're talking about the fleet will turn over 100% of its members a year. And the recruiters are charged, they're all paid on commission. They're trying to recruit about 3 people a week at the big firms, and they make these outlandish promises, and they get people in, they attach them with debt, and then they wield that debt like a threat.
Can we assume that a lot of the turnover is people who simply can't support that debt load and abandon it?
I think it's a mix. So one, trucking, as we said, is a gargantuan industry. There are many, many, many different types of truckers. The type of trucker that I focused on in the book is a CDL licensed over the road trucker, OTR, who is the backbone of the grocery industry. So that's why I focused on them. There are movers and there are local truckers who are doing, from job site to job site, picking up construction. There are many different forms of trucking. So this is all a caveat to say that there's turnover that is between sectors, which may not be as as big a warning sign as the turnover which is what you're saying, which is certainly a sizable amount of people who are just flushed out of the profession, who sign up for a own to lease to own program and are told they're owner operators of their own truck, but they have to pay off that truck and essentially never get a chance to make enough money to pay off that truck, and then exit the profession with less money than they walked into after giving God knows how many miles and time of their life.
And you also make the point that they are strapped literally into a job that leaves them unhealthy with very little recourse to exercise and very little ability to find fresh food, as those of us with a wilderness of choice find whenever we go to a highway truck stop because we're forced to. And then we think, no, I'll just wait till I can go to a Whole Foods, or something we can afford to do. So hearing about
100%. It's also, I just will say, it's extremely isolating profession. I think you are stuck in 12 by 12 box. If you're running team, which means you're doing it with another person, which is the industry's preferred model, you're sleeping in that truck on top of your coworker, essentially in a bunk bed situation. It doesn't take much imagination to understand how that situation can become extremely abusive, especially if you're a female trucker. You're partnered with a male trainer who controls whether or not you ascend in the career ladder and make it out of being a trainer. You're on the road in the most isolated situation. And so that gender dynamic, I go over in the book. I didn't talk to a female trucker who didn't know somebody who had a bad experience. And I talked to as many female truckers as I could. But it's not even a gender thing. I mean, if you're stuck with an abusive male person, male bunkmate who's slowly losing his mind because you're on the road for 14 hours every day, it's not a great situation either.
So this is a very sobering picture of jobs we don't think about when we waltz into a supermarket. I think that some of us, especially probably the people listening to this talk, are aware of field and food raising jobs, the difficulties of them. Economic Opportunities Program, we at Food and Society have worked a lot with the coalition of Immokalee farm workers, which has raised national visibility and concern about workers' jobs in fields. And there are other organizations, and it's something we can never think about too much. Are there other unseen jobs you found in your research we should be thinking about as we walk into a supermarket?
Oh gosh, I mean, yeah, I think the whole first all praise Coalition of Immokalee Workers. I'm so glad that you brought them up. If we get a chance to talk about the positives, I think we should circle back there. Look, I think I was unaware of just the network of brokers and buyers and manufacturers, how a manufactured product gets to shelf, especially one that starts off as a raw commodity that's sourced. There's just so many components. I think I grew up with this image of a supply chain that was boxes with arrows, and they were basically like box cars, on a train. They're pretty linear, and it's like no. In the book, I look at the Thai shrimp supply chain, and I use that as a microcosm of because I think it is very indicative of a number of complicated supply chains that make up backbone commodities that we use. it's like a 6-layer supply chain. And if you were to draw those arrows, you'd just have hash marks all over because it's very intersecting. Still a small broker. Both the people who are sourcing the raw ingredients for the aquaculture that shrimp come from are small holders with individual boats. A lot of the shrimp producers are still small holders. That itself is fractured into like hatcheries, into people raising mature shrimp, into into processing plants. So the volume that the modern supermarket depends on, and these chains depend on a volume of supply that has so many small actors, and each of those actors is involved in a war for lowest price. The grocery store is structured around what we haven't really talked about, like kind of the big structural forces in the grocery store, but it's structured around volume, and it maintains that volume by maintaining very small margins and a very low price so that people buy a lot. And the way you get an advantage is by keeping that price low. And the way you keep that price low is that you put a lot of pressure on your buyers, put pressure on the importers and the exporters and the manufacturers to give them a lower price. They put pressure on the people who are producing for them, and they put pressure on the people who are doing the raw materials. And that pressure just gets compounded all down the chain for lower and lower price in a way that just completely amplifies when you get to the bottom and often comes out of workers. So your question of like where the hidden actors are, it just from the brokers who aggregate things, that was like a big source of surprise for me, how powerful they are, how subject they are to price controls, and what a role they play in supply chain visibility or invisibility in terms of sourcing from a wide swath of producers and being able to offer a manufacturer kind of plausible deniability about where their product comes from, especially if you have 3 or 4 brokers that you're sourcing from, and they all just assure you that, like, yeah, of course, those farms are great. You're not going to know because there's so much work to go into the supply chain on that level and source from individual local producers, especially in something that is not like agribusinessy and not super vertically integrated. All these kind of things that I think a lot of people walking around food think of as like really bad. We lift up the family farm and we lift up the smallholder, but what it does is it creates a lot of invisibility in the supply chain because sourcing from all sorts of smallholders requires a lot of hidden actors.
This is very easy to have us plunge into despair. So there isn't anything we could do about these brokers who allow all this deniability through the stepwise progress up the supply chain. We already have questions coming in about, oh, come on, please, what can I do? And we've already gone over this. So, I just have to read something that's so telling and so good that you said in an interview. Our food options allow us to express meaning. That is, food that allows us to demonstrate who we want to be, whether that's worldly and sophisticated, thin and athletic, decadent and indulgent, ecologically virtuous, connected to our ancestors, distinct from our kid, etc., down the line of human aspiration. So our buying choices and the romanticism of voting with our buying dollar, does that work? What can we do in a grocery store to try to improve labor conditions?
Okay, so I would say the take-home message of this book for me was an abandonment of this vote with your dollars mentality that I grew up with, that Eric Schlosser, Michael Pollan really introduced me to. Eric Schlosser ends Fast Food Nation, a book I loved, was very influential to me growing up, with make it your own way, the Burger King kind of slogan inverted. And guess what? We can create the system we want by making informed consumer choices. And I guess I reached the end of that paradigm in this book because of things like the Thai shrimp industry, where there were so many levels of obscurity between top and bottom that well-intentioned people within the industry who are buyers, whose whole job it was to source, people who are working at NGOs in the sector, whose whole job it was to demonize and call out bad actors, couldn't tell you who to buy from and who not to buy from when you were talking about a certain scale. Like, of course, they could point to one or two good farms, but when you get to a certain scale, they would throw up their arms. They wouldn't have great ideas of how to reform a supply chain. Now, this isn't universally true of every, category in the grocery industry, but certainly for some of our big commodities, it is. Then you take that dynamic of invisibility and you add in marketers and you add in an auditing system that is geared to making promises, which again, we haven't really touched on. And you get these layers that interrupt you from the actual conditions on the ground and that make a choice that you think you're a supposedly informed choice, not super informed. So that's the negative. Now let's get to the positive, which I think is there are programs like the Coalition of Unlucky Workers that you mentioned, Migrant Justice in Vermont, do their Milk with Dignity program that are doing really fantastic things, amplifying workers' rights, really shifting away from an auditing system that guarantees our food, and the auditing system is basically a snapshot of a company through prearranged visits. They go, they check financial records. They don't typically interview employees. It's just looking. It is debatably okay for empirical things like food safety, where you're like tracing a pathogen. And I think you can make an argument, at least, that it has had some role in that reform. When you get to something like a withheld paycheck at a place, and especially a withheld paycheck that was withheld 6 months ago from when the auditor visits in a language that the auditor doesn't speak, it becomes meaningless. So what these new programs that really emphasize worker-to-worker education, raising worker rights, and putting hotlines and apps, I know it sounds silly, but like workers have access to smartphones, giving them ways to raise their voice. A huge factor in this is like, do these organizations have a permit to go on site and talk to workers, engage with workers directly? Auditors don't have that right. They come for a pre-arranged visit, often with extreme restrictions on who they can and cannot talk to. So these programs that are worker-driven social responsibility, I think of that as a real bright spot, a real place where we could pour more resources in. The downside is they're not scalable. They inherently work on like local knowledge, deep in like roots, building trust with workers. And so you're not going to get a program like that and then like poof, now it's going to cover even the whole East Coast. Migrant Justice is great in Vermont. They're not something that you can just take and transplant to Texas.
Okay, so we'll go on to the websites of CIW, Coalition of Vermont Workers, CIW.org, and Migrant Justice. Will I only arouse more despair-inducing cynicism if I ask about third-party certifiers and if there are, little marks on labels? Animal Welfare, Marine Stewardship Council. I'm in favor. I'm partial to one called How Good, because I know the founders who try to rate food on a whole variety of parameters, including worker treatment. Have you found any that you trust or any that you personally look for when you buy food?
How Good is, I have not a bad thing to say about How Good, actually. I'm not, in general, you then have to just drill to the next level of these things. Again, things that are based on snapshot audits, no good, in my opinion, when it comes to things like environmental justice, when it comes to workers' rights. If you're looking for a gluten-free product, the gluten-free label is probably great. But it's not a helpful if you're looking for fair trade. So I don't put a lot of stock in there to answer your question. I look for like employee-driven cooperatives. Bob's Red Mill is a great example. There anything where there's a 30% ownership stake by employees. There's some evidence there that is a place where we can, it's a real leverage point where employees felt feel bought in. None of these things are panacea, though. If you're a manufacturer that's employee owned, you still have the same low price incentive to put pressure on your suppliers. And so your employees might be good, but you're still going to be putting pressure down the chain. Systemic change, I think, really is going to come from raising worker and empowering workers, whether through unions, whether through these worker voice programs, through big systemic things like we need trade treaties with like teeth, with police enforcement attached to it. We have trade treaties that say the most beautiful things about illegal labor and forced labor. And then when you come to try to enforce that, there are delays, there are, court rulings with completely unclear enforcement mechanisms, right? These are violations of workers' rights that involve like often imprisonment, stealing of wages. You need a police action to combat that. You don't need an NGO to step into that space. So those are I'm an advocate of structural change, I guess, after this book, not about consumer choice.
Great. I remember that is something you strongly, it's a real takeaway of your book, this voting with your fork. And I love Eric Schlosser's book, which is the most eye-opening book about labor practices in the US, really since the Second World War. Policy change. What should we be advocating for?
Yeah, I think just that like laundry list I just gave. I think really thinking about our trade policies and clear dispute mechanisms, building that into the new treaties we're negotiating in Asia. Like there was some new advances, I think, with the new North American agreement with Mexico. Obviously, many people found them disappointing. I think they were a step forward. They were not a step forward enough, but the more that we can have policy level shifts that are pro-union. I'm a big fan of the current FTC that, it's kind of controversial. They're picking fights with people. They're losing some of those fights, but I think at least they're trying. At least they're enforcing these rules that with Robinson Patman and other places. They're taking rules on the book and they're raising them into the public sphere, and that's going to have a ripple effect on corporate behavior. Whether or not they're successful with the challenge, I think we don't know. We'll see. But I think, robust enforcement of antitrust laws, and again, like getting people in office who understand that and are willing to take that risk, as opposed to worrying about it and keeping it in a theoretical space. There's trade treaties, I think. Just a general pro-worker, pro-unionization framework. And the answer is not always unions. There are plenty of privately owned places that don't negotiate with unions, but have the threat of informed workers to keep them honest. I think that those are really important ingredients.
Great. Pro-worker businesses trying to understand which are genuinely pro-worker will be flooding your email box saying, is that one good? Is that one good? And then smiling a little less gratefully and just making a more like transaction.
Just give them a good Bronx cheer.
All of your advice and your experience have been invaluable. And I have a heavily marked up copy of the cover, but The Secret Life of Groceries by Benjamin Lorr is the book everybody should read and teachers should assign, and all of our Food Leaders Fellows will be required to read. So thank you, Benjamin Lorr, for joining us today, and thanks to our friends at the Economic Opportunities Program for making this whole terrific series possible.